The harsh winter winds swept through the ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, a small settlement in Wyoming Territory, 1875. Inside, Sarah Mitchell clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma to her chest, trying to share what little body heat remained between them. The fire had gone out hours ago, and there wasn't a splinter of wood left to burn. Sarah's cheeks were hollow, her once vibrant auburn hair now limp and dull. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving the last scraps of food for her baby, but even that was gone now. The empty cupboard stood open, a silent testament to her desperate situation. Outside, snow piled against the cabin walls, and the howling wind found every crack and crevice. She'd been abandoned 4 months ago when her husband rode off, supposedly to find work in the mines, leaving her with empty promises and a newborn. No letter, no money had arrived since. Would you please subscribe to the channel? I'm curious to know what city you're watching from. Sarah's eyes wandered to the window, where through the frost-covered glass, she could see the outline of the Henderson Ranch a mile down the valley. Old Man Henderson had more horses than he could count, fine stock that fetched top dollar from buyers who came all the way from Denver. She'd asked for work there twice, but Henderson's wife had turned her away, muttering something about women of questionable virtue, as if being abandoned with a child made her somehow responsible for her husband's desertion. Sarah's hands trembled as she placed Emma in the makeshift cradle. The baby whimpered, her cries growing weaker by the day. This wasn't a decision Sarah took lightly, but a mother watching her child starve had few choices left. She pulled on her husband's old coat, wrapped a threadbare scarf around her face, and pressed a gentle kiss to Emma's forehead. "I'll be back with food, little one," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Mama's going to fix this." Sheriff Thomas Reed sat at his desk in the jailhouse, reviewing wanted posters by lamplight. At 45, Reed was a fixture in Redemption Creek, having brought law to the frontier town nearly 15 years ago after retiring from the U.S. Marshals. Deep lines etched his weathered face, and gray streaked his once dark brown hair and mustache. Unlike many lawmen who ruled through fear, Reed had earned respect through fairness and a steady hand. He'd seen enough killing during the war to last several lifetimes. Justice, not vengeance, was his code. The small town had grown accustomed to his quiet authority, his worn Stetson, and the Colt 45 that rarely left its holster these days. As he sipped cold coffee, his deputy burst through the door, bringing with him a blast of winter air and urgent news. "Sheriff, Henderson's reporting a horse theft. One of his prized Appaloosas taken right from the stable." Thomas sighed, setting down his mug. Horse theft wasn't just a crime. In Wyoming Territory, it was an offense that could end with a hanging. Henderson was an influential man, one of the town's founding members and its wealthiest citizen. He wouldn't let this pass. "Anyone see who took it?" Thomas asked, already pulling on his heavy coat. The deputy shook his head. "Not clearly, but Henderson's stable boy thinks it was a woman." Thomas paused, his brow furrowing. A woman stealing a horse in this weather? That was unusual enough to give him pause. Most horse thieves were drifters or outlaws passing through, looking to make quick money by selling stolen stock in the next territory. Which direction were the tracks heading? The deputy pointed north, toward the foothills where several homesteads struggled against the harsh Wyoming elements. "Get the horses ready," Thomas ordered, "and bring extra blankets. Nobody with sense would be out in this cold without good reason." The tracks weren't difficult to follow, even with snow drifting across the trail. The thief had made no attempt to hide their path, a straight line from Henderson's ranch toward the cluster of homesteads that dotted the northern valley. As they crested a small rise, Thomas spotted smoke rising from one of the more distant cabins, barely visible through the swirling snow. He recognized it as the Mitchell place, where that young woman lived alone with her baby after Jacob Mitchell had disappeared months ago. Thomas had never trusted Mitchell, a smooth-talking drifter who'd swept into town and charmed the daughter of the local seamstress. When news reached them that gold had been discovered further west, Mitchell had vanished like morning dew, leaving behind his pregnant wife. Thomas had checked on Sarah once or twice after the baby came, bringing supplies from the church charity box, but pride had made her reluctant to accept help. Now, as they approached the cabin, Thomas spotted Henderson's prize Appaloosa tied to a post outside. The scene inside the cabin hit Thomas like a physical blow. Sarah Mitchell knelt before a newly lit fire, her hands shaking as she warmed a small pot of broth. The baby lay wrapped in blankets nearby, making weak mewling sounds that reminded Thomas of a half-starved kitten. The cabin was nearly bare of furnishings, with gaps in the walls where chinking had fallen away. A small pile of fresh meat sat on the rough-hewn table, rabbit and what looked like prairie hen. Sarah looked up as the door opened, her eyes widening with fear, then resignation. She didn't run or plead, just stood slowly, placing herself between the lawman and her child. "Sheriff Reed," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "I suppose you've come about the horse." Thomas nodded, taking in the desperate conditions. "Henderson wants his property back, and the thief in jail," he said evenly, though his heart was already warring with his duty. Sarah's composure cracked, just slightly. "I was going to return it tomorrow. I just needed—" She gestured toward the meat, then to her child. "Emma hasn't eaten properly in days. I tried everything else." Thomas removed his hat, a gesture of respect despite the circumstances. His deputy shifted uncomfortably behind him. "Ma'am, horse theft is a serious offense in Wyoming territory," the deputy began, but Thomas raised a hand to silence him. Sarah's chin lifted defiantly. "I know what the punishment is, Sheriff, but I'd rather hang than watch my baby starve to death." The simplicity of her statement, delivered without dramatics or pleading, struck Thomas to his core. He'd enforced the law for most of his adult life, believing in its necessity for civilization to flourish on the frontier. But the law had never accounted for a mother's desperate choice when faced with her child's hunger. Thomas turned to his deputy. "Take the horse back to Henderson. Tell him we have the thief in custody." The younger man looked confused, but nodded, leading the Appaloosa outside. When the door closed, Thomas removed his heavy coat and hung it on a peg by the door, a gesture that said he wasn't leaving immediately. "Sit down, Mrs. Mitchell. Finish making that broth for your little one." Sarah hesitated, confusion replacing the resignation in her eyes. "Aren't you taking me to jail?" Thomas pulled a chair from the table and sat, his large frame making the crude furniture seem even more fragile. "Let's talk first. There's more than one kind of justice." Sarah returned to the fire, stirring the pot with mechanical movements. "What is there to talk about? I stole the horse. I knew what I was doing." Thomas watched as she tested the broth's temperature before carrying it to the baby. The child's eager response to food tore at something deep in his chest. He'd lost his own wife and unborn child to fever 12 years ago. Since then, he'd poured himself into being the law in Redemption Creek, a solitary figure who kept his pain buried beneath duty. "Henderson will demand satisfaction," he said finally. "He's not a forgiving man, and horse theft can't go unpunished. Not if we want to maintain order. Sarah nodded as she fed her daughter small spoonfuls of the warm liquid. I understand. Just give me until morning. Let me make sure Emma is fed and warm. I can ask Mrs. Peterson from church to take her. Her voice broke on the last words, the first sign that her brave facade was cracking. Thomas leaned forward, his decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. There's another option, Mrs. Mitchell, one that might solve both our problems. Sarah looked up sharply, wariness replacing grief in her eyes. Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly feeling every one of his 45 years. Wyoming Territory needs settlers, families putting down roots. The law respects marriage and property. He met her gaze steadily. I have a house in town, 2 bedrooms, solid walls. Your daughter would never go hungry. Sarah stared at him, comprehension dawning slowly. Are you suggesting? Thomas nodded, feeling strangely calm about a proposition he'd never imagined making when he woke that morning. I'm offering you a choice, Mrs. Mitchell. I can take you to jail today for horse theft, and your daughter becomes a ward of the territory. Or, he paused, making sure she understood the gravity of what he was proposing. You can marry me. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. You and your daughter would have a home, food, protection. And Henderson couldn't touch you as the sheriff's wife. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft sounds of the baby. Sarah studied him with intense scrutiny. Thomas knew what she saw, an aging lawman, past his prime, with weathered features and calloused hands. Not the kind of man a young woman would choose freely. Why would you do this? She finally asked. You don't know me. Thomas glanced at the child, then back to Sarah. I know enough. I know you'd risk hanging to feed your daughter. That tells me what kind of mother you are. He shifted in the too small chair. And I've been alone a long time. This town respects me as their sheriff, but a man needs more than respect to warm his home. He held up a hand when she started to speak. I'm not asking for anything you don't wish to give. Just companionship, perhaps. Someone to come home to. Sarah cradled Emma against her shoulder, gently patting the baby's back. Her mind raced through the limited options before her. Jail would mean certain death for her child. Pride had nearly cost them their lives already. And Sheriff Reed had always been fair, one of the few in town who hadn't judged her when Jacob abandoned them. If I agree, she said carefully, this would be a real marriage? Legal and binding? Thomas nodded solemnly. Before God and the territory, no one would question it. Sarah took a deep breath, her decision made not from romance, but from the fiercest love she knew, a mother's devotion to her child. Then I accept your offer, Sheriff Reed, for Emma's sake. Thomas stood, his expression softening. For both your sakes, Mrs. Mitchell. And please, call me Thomas. He moved toward the door, reaching for his coat. I'll speak to Reverend Collins and handle Henderson. Pack whatever you wish to bring. I'll return tomorrow with a wagon. Thomas faced Henderson's fury with the calm assurance that had made him an effective lawman. The rancher's face turned nearly purple when Thomas explained that the thief was being handled according to territorial law, though not precisely in the manner Henderson might expect. You can't just let her go, Henderson sputtered, pounding a fist on his ornate desk. What kind of example does that set? Next thing, every desperate drifter will be helping themselves to my stock. Thomas met the rancher's gaze steadily. Sarah Mitchell won't be let go, Mr. Henderson. She'll be under my supervision permanently, as my wife. The stunned silence that followed gave Thomas a moment of quiet satisfaction. Henderson's wife, who had been hovering nearby, gasped audibly. Your wife? Thomas, have you lost your mind? She's a thief, and her husband? Thomas cut her off with uncharacteristic sharpness. Her husband abandoned her and an infant to starve. The law I uphold protects property, yes, but it also protects the vulnerable. Your horse has been returned unharmed. Justice will be served, but with mercy. The next morning, Reverend Collins performed the brief ceremony in the small church at the edge of town. Sarah wore her only decent dress, faded blue calico with carefully mended seams. Emma, wrapped in a new blanket Thomas had purchased from the general store, slept peacefully in a basket nearby. There were no guests, no celebration, just vows exchanged under the watchful eyes of God and the frontier law. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as Thomas placed a simple gold band on her finger. His late wife's ring, taken from the drawer where it had lain untouched for 12 years. As they signed the marriage certificate, Thomas noticed Sarah's hesitation, the pen hovering above the paper. "Is something wrong?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, a flush coloring her pale cheeks. "I was just thinking that I'm now Sarah Reed," she said softly. "I'm no longer bound to a man who abandoned us." Thomas nodded, understanding. It was a small thing, perhaps, but names carried power on the frontier, a fresh start. The town's reaction to their sudden marriage ranged from shocked disapproval to grudging respect. Thomas ignored the whispers and sidelong glances as he escorted his new wife and her daughter to his home on Maple Street. The house was modest but solid. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper stove, a small parlor with actual glass windows. To Sarah, who had been surviving in a drafty cabin, it seemed like unimaginable luxury. Thomas showed her to the larger bedroom. "This will be yours and Emma's room," he said, setting down her meager belongings. "I'll take the smaller one down the hall." Sarah stood awkwardly in the center of the room, still trying to process the dramatic turn her life had taken in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been facing starvation or hanging. Today, she was the sheriff's wife, standing in a warm house with a proper bed. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, but Thomas shook his head. "No need for thanks between us. We made a bargain, fair and square. You're giving me a family name, companionship. In return, you have security." That evening, Sarah prepared a simple meal from the well-stocked pantry. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, watching with quiet appreciation as she moved around the kitchen. Emma balanced on her hip. The domesticity of the scene stirred emotions he'd long suppressed. "You cook well," he commented as they ate. Sarah smiled faintly. "My mother taught me. Before she passed, she ran a boarding house in St. Louis, said a woman who could cook would never starve." Her smile faded. "She didn't account for Wyoming winters and a vanished husband, I suppose." Thomas nodded, not pressing further. There would be time for sharing their histories. For now, it was enough that they were both fulfilling their parts of the arrangement. After dinner, Thomas took his coat. "I need to make my evening rounds," he explained. "Sheriff's duties don't end with marriage. Make yourself at home." When he returned hours later, he found the house quiet. A lamp left burning low in the parlor, and a plate of food kept warm on the back of the stove. A small gesture, but it had been years since anyone had fought to wait up for him. Days stretched into weeks as winter maintained its grip on Redemption Creek. The arrangement between Thomas and Sarah settled into a cautious rhythm. They shared meals and necessary conversation, but maintained careful boundaries. Thomas was unfailingly polite, never presuming upon his rights as a husband, treating Sarah with a respect she had almost forgotten was possible between a man and woman. For her part, Sarah transformed the bachelor's house into a home, bringing order to Thomas's haphazard housekeeping, cooking meals that gradually coaxed him into sharing stories from his days as a U.S. Marshal. In the evenings, Thomas would sometimes hold Emma while Sarah sewed or prepared food for the next day. The baby, thriving now with proper nutrition and warmth, had taken to the sheriff with surprising ease, often falling asleep against his broad chest. These quiet moments, more than anything, began to crack the protective walls around both their hearts. The first real test of their arrangement came when Jacob Mitchell returned to town. The spring thaw had brought travelers back to Redemption Creek, and with them, rumors of gold strikes further west that had proven disappointing. Jacob swaggered into the sheriff's office one afternoon, his clothes worn, but his smile as confident as ever. "Heard you might know where my wife's staying these days, Sheriff," he drawled, seemingly unaware of how Thomas's expression had hardened at the sight of him. "Thought I'd collect her and the baby, now that I've got some prospects lined up in Colorado." Thomas rose slowly from his desk, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered Colt. "Your wife," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You must be mistaken, Mitchell. There's no one by that name in Redemption Creek." Jacob's smile faltered. "Now, Sheriff, don't play games. Sarah Mitchell, my wife, pretty little thing with red hair, had my baby while I was away seeking our fortune." Thomas stepped around the desk, his imposing height forcing Jacob to look up at him. "I believe you're referring to Sarah Reed, my wife." He emphasized the last two words with quiet force. "The woman you abandoned to starve with an infant during the worst winter in a decade." Jacob's face drained of color as understanding dawned. You married my wife? That's not legal. We were never divorced." Thomas smiled without warmth. Interesting concern, coming from a man who deserted his family without support or word for over 6 months. The territorial judge would be very interested in hearing about that, especially since abandonment is grounds for dissolution of marriage. But that's academic now. Sarah chose a new path, one that doesn't include you. Jacob's hand twitched toward his hip, but the movement died when he met Thomas's steady gaze. "I suggest you continue on to Colorado, Mitchell. There's nothing for you in Redemption Creek." When Thomas returned home that evening, he found Sarah waiting anxiously on the porch, Emma in her arms. Word traveled fast in small towns. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "Jacob's back?" Thomas nodded, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. "He came to my office. He won't bother you." Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the porch railing. "What did he say? What did you tell him?" Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the first time he'd initiated such contact between them. "I told him the truth, that you're my wife now, legally and properly, that he has no claim on you or Emma." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "He'll try to take her, I know him. If he thinks there's any advantage—" Thomas shook his head firmly. "Sarah, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "No one is taking Emma from you. No one is taking you from this home. I give you my word." That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah found Thomas in the parlor, staring into the fire with a glass of whiskey in his hand. She sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly. "Not just for today, but for everything, what you did for us." Thomas looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You don't owe me thanks, Sarah. We made a bargain." She shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "A bargain where you gave everything and asked almost nothing in return. Most men would have—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew what rights a husband could claim. Thomas set down his glass. "I'm not most men, and you've given me more than you know. This house was just a place to sleep before. Now it's a home again. He hesitated, then added softly, "You remind me of her sometimes. My Catherine. Not in looks, but in spirit. She was strong too." For the first time, Thomas spoke of his late wife, the fever that had taken her and their unborn child, the years of solitude that followed. Sarah listened, recognizing the gift of his confidence. When he finished, she found herself telling him about her own past, her childhood in St. Louis, her mother's death, the journey west with a family seeking domestic help, and then meeting Jacob, whose promises had seemed so golden. "I was foolish," she concluded, staring into the fire. "So desperate to be loved that I didn't see what was right before me." Thomas shook his head. "Not foolish, young, hopeful. There's no shame in that." A comfortable silence fell between them, different from the cautious quiet of their earlier days together. Later, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Thomas paused in the hallway. "I meant what I said to Mitchell. No one will take you or Emma from here unless it's your choice to go. This is your home now, for as long as you want it." Spring bloomed across the Wyoming Territory, painting the valleys with wildflowers and new grass. In Redemption Creek, the change of seasons brought new life in more ways than one. Emma took her first steps across the kitchen floor, tumbling into Thomas's waiting arms with peals of laughter. Sarah expanded the garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil with the same determination that had seen her through the winter. And Thomas found himself lingering at home more often, volunteering to watch Emma while Sarah attended ladies' aid meetings at the church, surprising himself with how naturally he took to bouncing the little girl on his knee or reading to her from old newspapers. The townspeople gradually accepted the unusual marriage, especially as they witnessed the transformation in their sheriff, the ease in his smile, the lessening of the shadows in his eyes. One evening in late spring, Thomas returned home to find Sarah on the porch, a letter clutched in her hand and tears on her cheeks. His heart clenched with immediate fear. "What's happened? Is Emma all right?" Sarah nodded quickly, wiping at her tears. "She's fine, sleeping. This came today." She held out the letter. "It's from the territorial court. Jacob filed a petition claiming our marriage is invalid because he never legally abandoned me." Thomas took the paper, scanning its contents with growing anger. This is nonsense. He was gone for months without a word. Every person in town can testify to that. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself despite the warm evening. "He claims he sent letters and money that must have been lost. And he has witnesses who'll swear he spoke of returning to me." Thomas crumpled the letter in his fist. "Liars, paid to say whatever he wants. But why now? What does he hope to gain?" Sarah's voice was bitter when she answered. "He heard about my inheritance. My mother's cousin in St. Louis died last month. He had no children, and he left his dry goods business to me. Jacob always said the old man was fond of me." She laughed, without humor. "Apparently, now that I might be worth something, he wants his wife back." Thomas sat heavily on the porch step beside her. "Do you want to go back to him?" The question cost him dearly, but he had promised her freedom to choose. Sarah turned to him, genuine shock in her expression. "Go back? To Jacob? After everything?" She shook her head vehemently. "Never. Not if he were the last man in Wyoming Territory." Relief flooded through Thomas, followed by a steely resolve. "Then we'll fight this. I know every judge in 3 territories. Jacob Mitchell might have a legal claim on paper, but the law out here considers more than documents. It considers character, actions. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "Do you trust me, Sarah?" The hearing was set for the following month in the territorial court. As the day approached, Sarah grew increasingly anxious despite Thomas's assurances. She knew Jacob's charm, his ability to twist facts and present himself as the wronged party. The night before they were to travel to Cheyenne for the hearing, she found herself unable to sleep. The sound of Emma's soft breathing from the cradle beside her bed usually brought comfort, but tonight it only heightened her fears. What if the court ruled in Jacob's favor? What if she was forced to choose between surrendering her child or returning to a man who had abandoned them both? Unable to bear her thoughts any longer, Sarah slipped from her room and made her way to the kitchen for tea. She was surprised to find Thomas already there, sitting at the table with papers spread before him and a lamp burning low. "You should be resting," he said, looking up as she entered. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Sarah shook her head, moving to the stove to heat water. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see Jacob taking Emma away." Thomas pushed aside his papers and stood, crossing to where she stood. "That won't happen, Sarah. I won't let it." There was something in his voice, a fierce protectiveness, that made her turn to face him. In the lamplight, his features were softer than usual, the stern sheriff replaced by the man who had opened his home and heart to her and Emma. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about our arrangement, about what it means." Sarah's heart quickened. They had lived as husband and wife in name only for months now, their relationship built on respect and growing friendship, but nothing more. There had been moments, shared glances, lingering touches, but both had been careful to maintain the boundaries established at the beginning. Thomas took a deep breath. "When I married you, I offered a bargain, protection for companionship. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that for me." His eyes held hers steadily. "I love Emma as if she were my own. And you?" "I never expected to feel this way again after Catherine. Never wanted to." Sarah felt warmth spreading through her chest, a hope she had scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge. "Thomas," he held up a hand, "you don't need to say anything. I know this wasn't what you agreed to. But tomorrow, when we face that judge, he's going to ask about the nature of our marriage. And I want to be able to tell him truthfully that while it may have begun as an arrangement of convenience, it has become a true marriage in every way that matters, at least on my part." Sarah stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. "And if I told you it has become the same for me, that somewhere between your kindness to a desperate woman and your love for a child not of your blood, I found myself falling in love with you." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if both were afraid the moment might shatter. Then Sarah's arms wound around Thomas's neck, and his hands drew her closer, the months of unspoken longing finally finding expression. When they broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he whispered, "remember this. You and Emma are my family now, in the eyes of God and my heart, if not yet fully in the law." Sarah smiled through tears that were, for once, born of joy rather than fear. "Then let's make it official, Sheriff Reed, in every way." That night, Sarah moved her belongings into Thomas's room, and for the first time since their wedding, they truly became husband and wife. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was imposing, built of red brick with tall columns flanking the entrance. Sarah clutched Thomas's arm as they climbed the steps, Emma balanced on her other hip. Inside, the wood-paneled courtroom was already half full. Jacob sat near the front with a slick-looking lawyer from Denver. He turned as they entered, his gaze sliding possessively over Sarah before settling with calculation on Emma. Sarah felt Thomas stiffen beside her, his free hand moving instinctively toward his gun before he caught himself. "Easy," she murmured. "We do this the right way." He nodded, his jaw tight, but his steps steady as they made their way to their seats. Judge Wilson, a gray-haired veteran of frontier justice with a reputation for cutting through pretense, entered the courtroom. As the proceedings began, Jacob's lawyer presented their case first. A tale of a devoted husband seeking his fortune for his family, faithfully sending letters and money that mysteriously never arrived, returning to find his beloved wife stolen away by the local sheriff who had abused his position of authority. Thomas's lawyer, an old friend from his martial days, presented a different story. Documented evidence of Jacob's abandonment, testimonials from townspeople about Sarah's desperate situation, medical records from the local doctor noting Emma's malnourished state that winter. But the most damning testimony came when Jacob himself took the stand, and Judge Wilson began his questioning. "Mr. Mitchell, you claim you sent money to your wife. Do you have any proof of these transactions? Receipts from wire transfers, perhaps?" Jacob shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Your Honor, when a man's on the move, searching for work, he doesn't always have time for paperwork. I gave the money to trusted companions traveling back this way." The judge's eyebrows rose skeptically. "And do any of these trusted companions have names? Are any present to testify?" Jacob's confident facade cracked slightly. "They've moved on, Your Honor. Mining camps are transient places." Judge Wilson leaned forward. "Indeed. Mr. Mitchell, how much money would you estimate you sent to your wife over the 6 months you were absent?" Jacob brightened, apparently thinking this was safer ground. "Oh, at least $500, Your Honor. I struck it lucky early on." A murmur ran through the courtroom. $500 was a small fortune in the territories. The judge's expression remained impassive. "That's quite generous. And yet, when Sheriff Reed found your wife and child, they were starving in an unheated cabin. Your daughter was malnourished to the point of illness. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Jacob's smile faltered. "As I said, the money must have been stolen en route. It's not my fault if—" The judge cut him off. "Yes, a remarkable string of bad luck. Every single payment disappearing. One might almost believe you never sent anything at all." The questioning continued, Jacob's story unraveling further with each probing inquiry. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she spoke clearly and directly, describing the increasingly desperate months after Jacob's departure, her failed attempts to find work, the night she stole Henderson's horse, and Thomas's unexpected proposal. "And your relationship with Sheriff Reed now?" the judge asked. "How would you characterize your marriage?" Sarah looked at Thomas, seated behind the lawyer's table, his steady gaze giving her strength. "It began as an arrangement. Your Honor, I won't pretend otherwise, but it has become a true marriage, built on respect, shared purpose, and love." Judge Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "And if this court were to dissolve your current marriage and return you to Mr. Mitchell?" Sarah's voice didn't waver. "I would consider it a grave injustice, Your Honor. Thomas Reed saved my life and my daughter's. He has been a true husband and father when Jacob Mitchell chose to abandon both responsibilities." After both sides had presented their cases, Judge Wilson called a recess to consider his ruling. Sarah and Thomas waited in tense silence outside the courtroom, Emma playing contentedly at their feet, oblivious to the proceedings that would determine her future. Jacob paced nearby, shooting them occasional glares. When court reconvened, Judge Wilson's expression gave nothing away as he adjusted his spectacles and prepared to deliver his verdict. "This case presents an unusual situation," he began. "On one hand, we have the sanctity of a prior marriage contract. On the other, we have abandonment, a second marriage performed in good faith, and the welfare of a child to consider." He looked directly at Jacob. "Mitchell, while I find insufficient evidence to prove you willfully abandoned your family, with no intention to return, I find equally insufficient evidence that you provided any support whatsoever during your absence." The judge turned to Sarah and Thomas. "Sheriff and Mrs. Reed, while your marriage was contracted under unusual circumstances, I find it was entered into legally, with the previous marriage effectively dissolved through abandonment." Jacob started to protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Mr. Mitchell, the law of the territories recognizes that life on the frontier requires adaptations. When a man leaves his family without support for more than 6 months, with no communication, the law presumes abandonment. Your claims of sent letters and money are unsupported by any evidence beyond your word, which this court finds insufficient given the documented condition of your wife and child upon your departure and return." He straightened the papers before him. "It is the ruling of this court that the marriage between Sarah and Thomas Reed is valid and binding. The previous marriage to Jacob Mitchell is hereby formally dissolved on grounds of abandonment." Relief washed over Sarah in a dizzying wave. Thomas's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her as the judge continued. "Furthermore, given the circumstances of Mr. Mitchell's departure and return, coinciding suspiciously with news of an inheritance, this court awards full custody of Emma Mitchell, now Emma Reed, to Sarah and Thomas Reed." Jacob leapt to his feet, face contorted with rage. "This is robbery! She's my daughter! That's my wife!" 2 court officers moved quickly to restrain him as Judge Wilson's gavel came down sharply. "One more outburst, Mr. Mitchell, and you'll be held in contempt. Consider yourself fortunate that Sheriff Reed chose legal means to address this situation, rather than frontier justice. Many men would have resolved this matter differently when faced with a man who abandoned his family to starve." Jacob subsided, shooting Thomas a venomous glance that promised this wasn't over. As they left the courthouse, Emma secure in Thomas's arms, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. The future stretched before them, uncertain in many ways, but secure in the most important one. They were a family now, recognized by law as well as by their own hearts. Jacob Mitchell's threats would remain just that, empty words from a man who had proven his true character through his actions. The journey back to Redemption Creek was quiet, old Sarah and Thomas lost in their own thoughts about the path that had brought them to this point. It had begun with a desperate act, a horse stolen to feed a starving child. It had continued with an unusual proposal, jail or marriage, and somehow, through the slow accumulation of shared days, mutual respect, and growing affection, it had transformed into something neither had expected to find again: love, freely given and gratefully received. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Emma sleeping peacefully inside, Thomas took Sarah's hand in his. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Sarah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Only that I didn't steal Henderson's horse sooner," she replied, and Thomas's deep laughter rolled across the yard like summer thunder. In the distance, the mountains stood silhouetted against the fading light, a reminder of the harshness and beauty of the frontier that had brought them together. Sarah knew that life would never be easy in this unforgiving land. But she had found something precious among its challenges, a true partner, a father for her daughter, a love built not on fleeting passion, but on the solid foundation of respect, gratitude, and shared purpose. "I have something for you," Thomas said. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small wooden box and opened it to reveal a ring. Not the simple band from their hasty wedding, but a delicate silver piece set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've been saving it. Seems right that you should have it now." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as he slipped it onto her finger, alongside the gold band she already wore. "A proper wedding gift," he said, "now that we're a proper family." Sarah cupped his weathered face between her hands, studying the lines etched by sun and time. The kind eyes that had seen so much of life's harshness, yet retained their capacity for gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing something worth saving in a desperate woman who stole a horse." Thomas smiled, his hands covering hers. "And thank you for giving an aging lawman a second chance at happiness." As darkness settled over Redemption Creek, lamps were lit in windows throughout the town. From the Reed House on Maple Street came the soft sounds of a family at peace. Quiet conversation, gentle laughter, the occasional cry of a baby quickly soothed. Inside, Sarah moved through rooms that had once felt foreign, but now were undeniably home. Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, watching his wife and daughter with quiet contentment. The law he had served faithfully for so many years had always been about maintaining order, protecting the innocent, and ensuring justice. Tonight he understood more clearly than ever that true justice sometimes required looking beyond rigid rules to the heart of what mattered. Compassion, second chances, and the family bonds that form the real foundation of frontier society. What had begun with a stolen horse and an unusual ultimatum had become the greatest blessing of his life. Some might call it an unconventional beginning, but on the frontier, the most enduring things often came from the most unexpected circumstances. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.